Hello, welcome to Better Conversations Live. This is our first one for 2022. And I've got Ben Miller with me today, which is fantastic. How you doing, Ben?
Yeah, pretty good, thanks. And you?
Yeah, good. We've had a purposefully slow start back into our lives, so you're in the hot seat.
It does feel hot, actually. It does feel hot. Yeah, it's nice. It's nice to hang out because it has been a break, hasn't it? So
Yeah, hopefully a good, to come back to these things refreshed and so on. And actually, so just a quick reminder for everyone. Better Conversations is live most Tuesdays. We should probably say now, because we've determined that we like taking breaks. And so at 1 o'clock UK time, we live stream on LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, and also you'll find us on betterconversations.live. And the corresponding times in different zones is 8 a.m. Eastern time, North America, 2 p.m. Central European time, 5:30 India Standard Time, and a good old 10 p.m. for Australia, Sydney, East Coast, that is. So today Ben and I are going to be talking about cognitive diversity. This is actually Ben. This is the crux of your course, which we'll talk about later. But a really important part of for leaders is understanding the impact they can have. And understanding how to recognize members in their team and how they can support people to actually build team strength by being inclusive around cognitive diversity. And I'm going to let you talk to it and introduce your own story as well, because I think that's really kind of fundamental to this. But this is actually for folks tuning in. If you're watching live, please drop in your questions. For Ben, I'll try and make a note to look out for those, and we'll respond. And if you're watching the replay, just drop in your questions in the comments below the description, and we'll keep the conversation going if you've got anything specific that you want to ask Ben. But also, do follow Ben on LinkedIn. I don't know if we can put up his handle, Heidi. Fantastic. You'll find Ben Miller on LinkedIn. So that's probably the best way to reach out to him if you've got any questions about today. So this is part of a 3-part series. We're kicking off with this one, which is why now, Ben?
Yeah, well, I think thanks for the intro, Sehaam. I think that why now? There's probably several answers to it, and there's several reasons why we should be interested in cognitive diversity. But probably starting with, what is it first of all? And I guess probably just very simply, it's a way of describing the natural variation in the way that we think, we perceive, we interpret situations
really
and experiences. What have you dropped? What have you dropped?
I have a problem with these jumping out of my ear.
Wrong size.
Well, these are the largest size, so I keep putting it out there. If anyone's got any tips for keeping these in my ear, because when I smile too much, clearly something happens in my. Apologies, Ben.
I wasn't saying anything funny, but maybe you should use some glue. So
yeah, that's not a bad idea. So, yeah. So now is really important. I think it's been very topical as well. And just to get us back on track, and I apologize for my interruption. There's a lot that's been talked about with cognitive diversity in terms of understanding autism and ADHD and so on. And but do we really understand it? Do we, as leaders, really understand how to work with that? What do we do with that? We can be informed. It's like you can read a book, and know it in theory, but in practice, how do you actually apply that? Maybe if I could ask you, Ben, to tell us your story about getting, because you got diagnosed with ADHD as an adult. And I wonder whether you could give us a sort of tell us that story of how you came to discover that you had ADHD.
Yeah, well, just very briefly, I think sometimes we are, born into the world, and if the world makes a lot of sense, we don't question what it is that we're doing and where we're heading. But I probably just had quite a few experiences in my life where I seem to be swimming against the tide. An example of that is in school, and I probably masked some of my learning differences, but I found that school put me off learning. I tended to find that every time I went to the health service, it made me more ill. I guess I probably just found myself in certain workplaces and working under certain leaders where I really thrived. And then there was other occasions where I struggled. So I think, to summarize, I just found it quite difficult to find my sweet spot in certain environments and in certain stages of my life. And I think when you're having to swim against the tide, the older you get, the harder that becomes. And so I think that there's it's more common for people to have a diagnosis in adult life. And I just wonder, there's probably several reasons for that. There's a hell of a lot of change going on. There's a hell of a lot of uncertainty. And I think in some ways that our brain shapes the world, and the world shapes our brain. So as it's become more complex, more distracting for me, our brains are having to try and adapt as a result of it. So I think that the increase in diagnosis is probably because of the world which we live in, which is overwhelmingly complex and not how we evolved. And so I think that biologically we evolve very slowly, but culturally we're evolving really quickly. And I don't think our biology and neurology can keep up, frankly. So so I think that's just a perspective of my viewpoint.
And I guess also just understanding it more. I think that it feels like there's been a shift towards wanting to be, I don't know if it's a shift towards being more compassionate, more understanding. We're aware of so much more. We understand more from so many different strands of psychology, neuroscience, behavioral economics, and so on. It feels like we're more receptive to new knowledge, new understanding, a seeking. I think a lot around the data has also pushed for a personal quest to understand ourselves better, and perhaps with that has come this sort of thirst for information and knowledge and appreciation of our brains as well. Do you think that would be a fair comment?
Yeah, well, we live in the information age, and there's an infinite amount of information out there, and I think that that's a double-edged sword. I think in the past, information was key to survival, but I think that there's thinkers nowadays saying that actually when you have too much of something, actually the opposite becomes true, and actually being able to dial out basically all of the noise and focus in on the signal. And that's a really challenging thing to do. And there's just a hell of a lot of information out there about our psychology, about human behavior, about how we're wired, and some of it's useful, some of it's not useful, some of it's relevant on some occasions and maybe less so on others. And I think there is just a general interest in how we think and how different people think, and yeah, I think in the past probably we all had access to the same information, and so we were roughly operating.
Right.
If you think we've all got like the same operating system, okay, well, this is how we make sense of the world. This is how we understand how things work. And then over time, we've got all of this kind of disparate information, and we kind of realize actually the world is a lot more complex. Our brains are a lot more complex, and actually there's a hell of a lot we don't understand, and we're all working to slightly different types of information, and that's really great. Because actually, you kind of expand, societies become quite loose and, diverge, and then we converge again. We do need to find some sort of way of not just understanding difference, but actually understanding how we're kind of similar as well, and actually how we try and, I don't know, because we have all got very different perspectives now of the world. We're all sensing things in very different ways, and actually just trying to understand what that means collectively as well as individually, I think, is quite important.
And do you think all that knowledge and all that quest has made us happier?
Well, it doesn't appear. Yeah, or even smarter either. We've kind of got we've got higher and higher IQ, better and better grades, but we got worse and worse problems. The flip side is things have never been better if you look at it from a technology perspective, and you look at it from a few metrics perspective. But things have never been worse if you look at it from our social crises, our environmental crises, our kind of physical and mental health. Things perhaps are less good, and so being smart is clearly not the solution. Actually, there needs to be something more than just being book smart, and the happiness thing is quite an interesting thing, because there's a paradox that the more that we pursue happiness, the less happy we become, and so
why is that? Why do you think that's because we're trying to make our brains process too much, or we have latched on to things that really aren't the solution, but they pose as the solution?
Yeah, well, maybe there's two different things here. Maybe the information thing. So pursuing new information and learning new things, there is a dopamine reward from doing that, but maybe that's different to happiness itself, because we've kind of set up the whole of society really around making people happy, and so we've created a whole economy and society out of producing and consuming our preferences, but maybe part of what I'm trying to maybe explore with the course is that maybe we need to go in the opposite direction, or try and flip things from different perspectives. That maybe we don't get happiness from pursuing it directly, but maybe happiness comes from living life well. So maybe it's not necessarily a great goal, but it's more about the journey and the process. And I think maybe also we're in Western society, we kind of pursue pleasure, which is like the kind of hedonic treadmill, and so every time we kind of get to the next thing, we're not kind of satisfied, or we're satisfied just very briefly, and then we kind of move on to the next thing, whereas I think eudaimonia is the more long-lasting happiness, which perhaps is something which we should be considering. But also I think that we're also an individualistic society, and we're social species, and so actually a lot of happiness comes from the interaction with other people, and so if we're just pursuing happiness and pleasure individually, then I think there's research to show that other cultures that pursue it collectively in communities or with friends, they are happier. So I think there's a few different things there to explore.
Yeah, I definitely would agree with that. And thinking about just, for anyone who's travelled the world when it was easier to travel, um, and as an observer on other societies, often, less um, less privileged societies than maybe the UK is, and how just the simplicity of people gathering at the end of the day for a picnic, green, a little patch of green, a blanket, some food shared, actually, you as an onlooker, you're like, wow, that's a lovely, that looks like a lovely group of people are all laughing. They may not have very much, but actually, um, they are. They seem to be in a good space, in a good headspace, right? For what they have, and appreciation of each other as well. In a way that may be moving towards us, this individualization we've lost sight of. It's very philosophical.
Yeah.
What do you think? What do you think? What do you think the effect of our brain is on, like, how do we perceive difference? Why is it maybe that we perceive things so differently from one person to the next?
Well, I think there's genetic and biological reasons. So we're kind of predisposed to maybe think and feel in certain ways, and connecting here to something like the big 5 personality traits, neuroticism, conscientiousness, etc. So there's we see through multiple lenses. So one thing one day, when you're in a good mood, might be very different to stubbing your toe the next day when you're in a bad mood. You might flip something or throw something, but so kind of mood and behaviors and neurochemicals constantly fluctuate. So actually
Right.
we don't realize, but just every we all have cycles, and we all have all this kind of complex like things going on inside us which we're unaware of, because we can't put our attention and have awareness of all of these things going on inside. Otherwise we wouldn't do anything in the outside world. And so all of these things are going on really outside of conscious awareness. But then there's also the experiential side. And so if you think of that, going back to how we evolved in hunter-gatherer tribes, our kind of experience of the world of life would be very similar to one another. But then you think about the modern world, and about how we're all receiving different information. We're all on kind of different apps, we're all watching different entertainment shows, we're all doing things very different from one another. And if you think that every single thing that we do does something to our brain, either reinforcing a connection or creating a new connection, you kind of realize that we're all experiencing the world from a very different vantage point. And that's great, but we also need to find some sort of way of finding common ground. And so this thing about kind of difference, it needs to be almost balanced with, okay, well, what also brings us together? What do we find common ground over? What is our kind of shared purpose? And yeah, so I think it's not just a single one thing, cognitive diversity. It's the kind of how do you bring different minds together within a team, which is important as well.
And there are many more of us, right? There are more human beings on the planet. So if you think in mathematical terms, the permutations of the things that interest us or that we can involve ourselves in are going to be that many more. We've got quite a few comments, so I just wanted to jump in there. So Mag has joined us. Hi, Mag. And she says, happiness is like a butterfly, which when pursued is always beyond our grasp. But if you will sit down quietly, may alight upon you. Nathaniel Hawthorne is a quote. That's a lovely quote. Thank you for that. We've got Brett Freeman. It's got a few comments. Just looking quickly here, it says, I'm wondering if it's the dopamine of new learnings or the cortisol of being left out. Probably some and some. We all have different experiences and we all have different biases. No two brains are alike. Some of our perceptions are also very different, which I think you would agree with, right?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, very much so.
Yeah. So what comes under cognitive diversity? Like, what are we talking about what's the definition, I guess?
Well, I did cover that at the beginning, and I think that next week's conversation is probably more relevant to unpacking what we mean by it. But yeah, it just, our brain is responsible for pretty much everything we kind of think and do. So whether it's sensing, feeling, judging, perceiving, communicating, moving, making choices, our brain is involved in everything. So cognition really is just these mental actions, these processes of understanding what this information means. And our brain is our brain's purpose really is to ensure survival. And so if you think of everything that we think, everything that we feel, everything that we sense, our brain is processing it for this purpose. So understanding anxiety or certain emotions, these are all signals which our brain is telling us. And our biology is pretty much the same as Paleolithic times, but our kind of context is very, very different. So yeah, cognitive diversity really is just the many ways that we process information differently. And why should somebody be interested in that? I think as the world becomes more complex, as people become more diverse through the diverse experiences they're experiencing, there's a need to both be able to understand different perspectives and viewpoints, but also put them to good use. How do we solve problems better? But not just solve problems better. How do we find better problems to solve? How do we actually define what problems actually need solving and how we go about them? So cognitive diversity isn't just about solving problems. It's about how we get on with one another.
Right.
And quite kind of basic things about just understanding one another as well. It doesn't always have to be a problem solving mindset. Actually, sometimes we just need to develop relationships because that's what we need to do, and build trust and do things which are right, because that's what humans do. And so there's we'll come on to maybe these kind of different ways of different patterns, different ways of seeing and interacting with the world in next week's show. But I think that's just a quick summary.
So to the points that you just made, someone with ADHD or someone who is autistic is experiencing the world differently, and therefore is going to be responding in the way that's typical for them, in the way that makes sense for them. Why is it important that we incorporate and have people within organizations who are much more aware of and educated around how different conditions maybe show up within their team. What do you think that the value is there for organizations to really have people who get it?
Well, I think there's a why question there for the individuals, and it's tough trying to work in a way, live life in a way which isn't the natural way you're experiencing it. And so we might have, we all have maybe kind of slightly different strengths and challenges. And if we're, as individuals, constantly having to rely on our challenges or kind of weaknesses rather than our strengths, from an individual perspective, that can cause all sorts of problems. It can cause mental health problems, physical exhaustion problems. It can cause all sorts of indirect knock-on effects, and so that's not good. That's not a good thing for the individual, and it's not the right thing to do. But there's also the performance aspect, that if we can understand different strengths, and we can kind of make use of these towards a common goal, then everybody's a win-win. The kind of leader, the organization, and the individual. Right. And so I think it's we're still really roughly in a one size fits all culture, where we still roughly have to go to school and learn the same way, go to work and pursue the same types of jobs and work in a very similar way. We're kind of tinkering around the edges at the moment, but it still doesn't really. It's not really kind of hand in glove for a lot of people with autism, with dyslexia, with ADHD, or frankly with a lot of people. And I think that this I have a label, but my label's a jumping off point to find how I'm individual within that category. Right. And then everybody else, everybody's distracted, because the world we live in is distracting. And yeah, so I think that the way I see it is that we're also on the leading edge. On our kind of thinking is a bit more on the fringe. Our weaknesses are a bit more pronounced, our strengths are a bit more pronounced. So these are just more visible, but these are more visible in a way that maybe we're all heading this way. So there's an opportunity to ask, do we all want to go further in this direction, or is there another path? So I think that people with diverse minds offer an opportunity for leaders to accelerate in our current trajectory, but they also offer alternative paths, seeing the world perhaps flipped upside down, or in reverse, that actually, well, maybe we need to go over there instead of over there. So I think that trying to see this as a win-win is a kind of really important part of it.
I think that's so true, and that's why I think we are at the beginning of this journey to understand how to make the most of cognitive diversity in the teams that we operate in and so on. But if we think about existing organizations are probably still quite fixed in the way that they operate. Some are making adjustments. Is it enough? Does it really go far enough? And is it even talked about and appreciated as a business advantage, as a team advantage, as a performance thing? And I think there's still a lot of, there's an appreciation of it, and maybe an opening of discussions among family and friends and so on. Someone who maybe has ADHD, or you got diagnosed recently, or, but it's still not integrated the solution to how we operate isn't integrated into how we work, how we educate kids. Schools are still very, have a very specific structure that's, pretty much the same from one school to the next. But and then, if you are different, then you are, you get allocated, if you're lucky, to a special needs team. It's still, as you say, on the fringes. We haven't really decoupled how we operate and actually put something together that is maybe more holistic and points to the differences less.
Yeah, I totally. And I think that maybe we'll get to how leaders can start to make a few changes in the third show, the third podcast. But it's starting. Sometimes it's just starting small, and you can realize that is cognitive diversity or neurodiversity another policy, another initiative to enact, or is it something which connects everything which happens in the workplace? Because actually the way that we kind of think and perceive and interpret things shapes how we organize our workplaces, whether it's top down, bottom up, whether it's competitive or cooperative, and how we kind of think about diversity and talk about it, is something which we will talk about in next week's show. But actually, there's an opportunity for it to connect to everything, because we don't work in fields anymore. So a lot of our work basically is cognitive. So everything that we do in the workplace involves us analyzing, interpreting, creating, innovating, whatever it is. That requires our brain. So we rather than kind of focusing perhaps on the object, the thing which we're doing, maybe we need to understand how different people get to do that thing. Or it's kind of really the kind of interesting thing is, how do people do the same thing differently, and and why do we do that, and kind of understanding our kind of different motivations, our different needs and values. And so, I think just underneath all of this is, it can seem quite abstract, learning about all of these different parts of how we think, and that's great for some people. But then underneath all of it is just, how do we just understand each other better, and how do we just understand how what matters to each of us, how we go from A to B, why do we go from A to B? So we can look at it from two different angles. We can just get bogged down in the kind of categories and labels and policies and everything else, or we can just ask questions, be curious, understand each other better.
It reminds me of a conversation among a leadership cohort I was leading before the break, and we were discussing, how stressful online meetings are, and they tend to be back to back, and people are feeling quite sort of harassed and stressed by that. And the discussion was around so many different facets of that. The fact that it's actually quite exhausting, staring at a sea of faces, especially when you're not getting much body language reading back, and we're having to sort of do a lot more sort of processing, and we're probably making many more assumptions just because people aren't in front of us. But also the discussion around what's okay to do when you're on a video call. Like, is it okay to be staring at your laptop and doing some other task? Should you have your camera on? is it okay to have it off? You know, should you be paying attention or contribute? How do you behave in that? And we got into a discussion around in excuse me, in our new sort of remote working sort of standard. We're still figuring out what's okay, what's polite, what's rude, in terms of how we behave, and also an appreciation that actually somebody may find it really difficult to stare at a screen and needs to do something else, needs to occupy their brain on multiple levels while in the meeting. And maybe it's a responsibility of the facilitator of that meeting to make it pertinent. Like, you know, the reason that you're in this meeting is because you have some way of, you know, you need to contribute. And if you don't, should you be there? So it was fascinating. It covered so many areas that were obviously, you know, ranged from cognitive diversity through to, you know, what's polite protocol on a call, and generational differences as well. You know, if we were in a meeting in a physical room, it would be rude if you got out your laptop and started typing and doing something else. So what are your thoughts about the complexity that leaders are trying to navigate at the moment, in leading remote teams, and trying to create culture?
It's not easy.
Sorry.
It's not easy, and I think just to touch on you know, Brett's comment about you know, our biases, and you know, because I think we think we know more about what's going on than reality. And you know, to Brett's point about biases, I think we're all riddled with biases and blind spots, and you know, other kind of self-deceptive functions of our brains. And yeah, so I think that just, you know, as individuals, we're trying to deal with all of this complexity, you know, alone, when actually the only chance really of over, you know, of trying to understand what's going on is doing it collectively. But you know, just having, you know, groupthink isn't going to be sufficient either. So you know, is that kind of, you know, how do we kind of play to our strengths, but also how do we create a culture where it's okay to you know, highlight people's blind spots or biases? You know, I have, you have, we all have. So how do we normalize just saying, look, I think that, I think this bias might be going on here. You know, how do we create trust, you know, within teams, that actually we can call it out, or you know, we can, you know, have constructive conflict or have, you know, disagreement without fear, without you know, any kind of comeback. So I think we've got to try and find a way of, you know, trying to do this thing together, trying to do this thing with people who are different to us, and remembering one of our biases is to hang around with people who think like us, and yeah, we are kind of drawn to that. So yeah, look, it's not easy, but we kind of almost just have to go out of our comfort zone, to maybe do things which are a little bit unexpected, to kind of, you know, seek out novelty, you know, intentionally, to seek out different perspectives. Yeah, but it's not easy when you as a leader are trying to probably firefight, you know, a dozen other things at the same time as well.
And I think that's really the reason for you designing the course that you have, is to take people on a journey to understand how to be aware of it. What does it look like? How does it feel? If you put yourself in the spot of someone who maybe is neurodiverse or thinks differently, and then apply that, some experimentation to learn what that actually feels like, and what some creative solutions might be. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about, I just think now might be a good spot to kind of share more about your course, Diversity of Thought for Leaders. You might need to raise yourself a little bit, Ben, because you're, sorry, that wasn't a great spot for that picture. But
yeah,
if you, would you like to tell us, it's a 6-week course, and there's videos to watch, but then there's coming together with you to discuss some of the learnings. But tell us a little bit more.
Yeah, well, I think first of all, like, the brain's the most complex object in the universe. So this course is not going to give you all of the answers to every facet of the brain. But what I tried to do with designing this course, and I couldn't have designed it without you, Sehaam, taking me through it, and also going through your course as well, was that that just from my journey, my kind of journey to becoming diagnosed, my journey of almost spending a lot of my life going in the opposite direction to what society was trying to make me go. It just made me ask quite a lot of questions, both myself, who am I, where am I heading, what is society for? And so I think just understanding that kind of context was how I started exploring this course. And so there's lots of information out there about neurodiversity, and looking at it from a legal perspective, looking at it from a policy perspective, and very nuts and bolts stuff. But from my point of view, it doesn't really it doesn't really excite me. So this course really is about exploring what the brain does, how it evolved. So thinking about human evolution, thinking about our kind of current context, the challenges which we face, whether it's climate change, whether it's inequality, whether it's exponential tech. All of these are kind of connected to how we think and behave. And so the kind of, I guess it's probably just lots of little jumping off points to explore, how is our thinking behavior connected to these challenges, and how might we need to think and behave differently to solve these. And so I look at the current context, and look at our how we evolved. I look at the condition of our modern brain, and rather than seeing it as a problem to fix, it's a signal to listen to. So we have 297 categories of mental illness. Do we just blindly keep fixing broken people, or do we think about changing our broken conditions perhaps? And so the idea is really to try and get people to think about perhaps unconventional wisdom, to think about counterintuitive approaches, to think about how design touches everything we do, not just organizational design, systems design, but we can design rituals, we can design meetings, we can design how we show up as a leader, we can design pretty much anything we want with an intention of creating something new and creating a different outcome. And so the kind of design piece really goes well with you as a leader who coaches, and actually, okay, so you can coach, but you can also kind of design X, Y, and Z to create allow different minds to thrive at their best. And you can also design projects and spaces and other things where different minds can come together under a common purpose as well. And so it's just exploring all sorts of different things about the brain, exploring starting points for leaders, and they might be just how do you identify neurodiversity? How does it show up in the workplace? What how do you go about starting conversations, and how do you start thinking about what's in the conditions which are both amplifying and also amplifying both strengths and potentially weaknesses as well of those people with diverse minds. So, and then the final week is really just how do we start bringing it together? How do we start creating experiments? How do we start thinking differently about quite fundamental things in the workplace? So hopefully there's things for lots of different people, lots of different leaders. The idea is it's quite broad. There's quite a lot of additional resources and reading materials for people to explore and go deeper into. So hopefully that covers it well enough.
You're mute. Yeah. I was trying to get your course up so people could see what that looked like. So I'm just going to do that if you bear with me. I think what's you talked about, being finding ways of okay, sorry, I'm not doing a great job on navigating all of this at the moment. I'm going to skip that, but the being curious and involving people and finding out what works for members of your team, I think is so crucial. And you touched on, yes, one of the big elements of leaders who coach is this ability to really be inquiring, not make assumptions, and equally not try and come to solutions without involving other people. And actually it's the ability to create accountability by making sure that you don't disempower people, right? That you involve them and they co-create, or they take the lead on creating the solutions for themselves. And I think that's so important. It's a collaborative exercise when you're talking about creating environmental spaces at work that work for everyone, that are inclusive and so on. If folks would like to find out more about it, please do check out. We're enrolling now for a February start, and if you follow that URL, but we'll also put the link in the description as well. So that's kicking off on the 8th of February, and it's an intimate cohort, isn't it, Ben? It's we've got a maximum of 15 people that are going to go through the course, and it's 6 weeks of, I'll just run through them very quickly. It's an introductory week, thinking ahead and contextualizing, understanding the brain, the modern brain, and how we perhaps are overloading it with things to do, different thinking patterns, cultivating the right conditions, and then how do we bring that all together? How do we think and act differently as a team? And I think that's really key for leaders to understand neurodiversity, how to work with it, to get comfortable actually being in that space and have the conversations that they need to have, and know how to navigate some of those conversations, I think, as well. And the impact, making the links, I think, between maybe identifying some of the things that they're already seeing, the behaviors and reactions of members of their team, whether you're neurodiverse or not. And then what do you do with that? How do you incorporate it? How do you actually get into discussions that are inclusive, where people are creating the solutions, and being able to articulate them in a safe way as well, and share how does that affect, why am I reading it this way, to be able to advocate for themselves as well. And I think as a leader, that's really important, that you do create that environment, right, that is supportive and is okay. Because like a lot of these things, these are new areas for us to really incorporate. And if we haven't been invited into the conversation, we don't know how to start it or even how to continue it, that's a tough, we just won't go there. We just won't get into those discussions, and we'll misread people, members of our team, as maybe being difficult or unwilling to listen when actually something else may be going on.
Sounds good. Sounds good to me.
Sounds good to me.
Yeah. And I think also it can seem incredibly daunting, because everything is influenced by our brain, and an overwhelmed leader trying to get to grips with this for the first time, it can feel a bit overwhelming. But I also think that there's if you're curious, and you do things in the right way, it doesn't matter if you get things wrong. From my perspective, because there's so much to learn, and everybody's unique. So one person with ADHD is very different to the next person, and so on. So it's a learning exercise. It's a case of sometimes we don't know, and asking questions is great, and just doing things with the right intention is important. So yeah, I think that's just a good thing to underline.
And in terms of what's your hope, what's your vision then for a future world where we are more inclusive, where we are really understanding at a personal level, day to day, the value of cognitive diversity? What's that world that you imagine in the future?
I don't know if I necessarily have a particular vision. I think that people have had a very clear vision of the future. We can sometimes go off on the wrong path. But I think underneath all of this, what I'm trying to explore is, are we kind of reimagining human nature in the 21st century? And so I think that the kind of pandemic is almost like a kind of live exercise in understanding how we're kind of reevaluating, what we value, how we make choices, how we kind of just think and perceive the world. And so the pandemic was a completely novel experience. And that, if you think of every new experience, rewiring our kind of brain, making new connections, seeing things which were there before that perhaps we didn't see, but now we do see. And so everybody on some level is seeing things differently, and we're either more tuned into that or we're not. And I think that there's just, whoever you speak to, whether it's a parent, a teacher, a nurse, a small business owner, somebody that works in the city, there's people from all demographics, all shapes and sizes in society that are questioning, hang on a minute, what am I doing? Where am I heading? And so I do think that there's something about we've basically created society around goals and status and social standing and experiences and satisfying our preferences. Is there something about human nature that we are perhaps missing? That maybe the idea that we're more cooperative than we are competitive, maybe that we redesign society around human health and well-being, but not just our health, the kind of planetary health. Is it that humans are fundamentally creative, and so rather as machines become more productive than us, do we kind of flip to becoming creative, regenerative, people. So I think basically there's all these little experiments on the fringe from, you know, different thinkers in different communities creating different projects. And I think just there's an opportunity for people to explore what is it to be human in the 21st century, and how can different minds shine a spotlight on different facets of what that might be. Because I think just going down the same path, doubling down on what came before, it may work for some organizations and some people for a bit, but I think it just seems like maybe we're collectively living a life which doesn't exist anymore. And so, how can we think differently about that? So, that's probably a summary.
I think that's a great place to leave it, Ben. And so so next week we're going to be talking about thinking patterns. Do you want to just say a couple of things about thinking patterns to get us all psyched up?
Yeah, and I'll probably make some connections to this conversation in next week's podcast. But I'll probably talk a little bit about Ian McGilchrist's work, who's a prominent psychiatrist and philosopher. And his work really examines the fact that we have a brain which is full of connections, but is profoundly divided into two hemispheres, and those hemispheres are asymmetrical. And he's basically done this tour de force book, and also some recent edition new books as well, exploring how these hemispheres work in opposite ways, quite often in conflicting ways, sometimes together, and they're more connected within hemispheres rather than across. And his work basically debunks all of the ideas which psychologists had in the 20th century about the differences between the hemispheres. And so he looks at them instead through broad patterns of how they do the same things differently, because they're involved in everything that we do, but their take, their values, their preferences are fundamentally different. And so just want to explore just a few of those patterns, and perhaps we'll talk about how they connect with communication and having better conversations, and link it into the work which you do.
Brilliant. Look forward to that, Ben. So folks, do join us next Tuesday at 1 o'clock UK time. We'll be live again for part 2 of Cognitive Diversity with Ben Miller. And do follow the links, check out his course, and if you've got any questions, reach out to Ben or myself. We'd happily answer as many questions as we can for you. Do you think I might find a solution for my ears popping, literally?
No, I think you just have to, and or maybe like an elastic band which goes around your ears and your face.
Yes, I was thinking about that. I might have to investigate. Excuse me.
There's a creative solution, definitely.
There's got to be. I need some brains on that. We shall see you. Have a brilliant week, everyone, and thank you, Ben. That was really lovely. Really lovely to catch up with you again and kick off the year on Better Conversations Live. So we'll see everyone on Tuesday next week.
Enjoyed the chat. Thanks for tuning in, folks.
Cheers, Ben.
Bye.
Bye.